Welcome to this WeMove Adolescent Health webinar, hosted by the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. My name is Rebecca Hodis, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, Archaeology and Development Studies at the University of Pretoria. Thank you all for joining us today, and we're looking forward to an interesting and interactive session. Today, we are presenting to you the fifth webinar in the third WeMove series, and the focus is Participatory Research Methods with Adolescents. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation's YouTube channel in due course. Today, we will hear talks from Professor Claudia Mitchell and Dr. Lynn Hendricks, in between which we will have an artistic appearance by Noluthando Buthelezi. This will be followed by a panel discussion where our speakers will be joined by Dr. Neziswa Titi, Lebo Seutlwadi, and Alice Clarfelt as discussants. To start off, we'd like to know a little bit more about what you think, and so we have prepared some poll questions with which you can engage. Please look out for the poll. Please look out for the poll, which will appear on your screens now, and complete it by clicking on your preferred responses on the screen. Please state whether the following statements are true or false. 1. Adolescent health research enables young people to understand the societal factors that contribute to the health challenges burdening their communities. 2. Community-based participatory research is another research method that promotes equitable collaboration between young people as research stakeholders and academic partners. True or false? And statement number 3, allowing young people to lead research requires additional resources to accommodate the developmental needs of young people that include recreational and academic commitments. So we're going to wait for a minute or so for people to cast their responses, and the results will be displayed on my side of the screen. So as the answers are coming through, I see pretty much everyone, 90% of the audience thinks that the first question is true, which is correct. About 10% thinks that it's false. If you'd like to jump in and let us know why you think that's false, please go ahead and unmute yourself and let us know what you think about that, why you think that it's false. Community-based research, participatory research is another research method that promotes equitable collaboration between young people. 100% think that that's true. And then allowing young people to lead research requires additional resources to accommodate the developmental needs of young people as research stakeholders and academic partners. 100% of people think that's true. Sorry, I'm getting confused here. Number 3, allowing young people to lead research requires additional resources to accommodate the developmental needs. 90% of people think that's also true. So we've got a lot of investment in the truth of these statements. I wonder about those who thought that the statement was false. We really would like to hear from you. So perhaps when we get to the question and answer time, please raise your hand and let us know why you think those answers may be false. Now I'd like to introduce the first speaker for today's webinar, Professor Claudia Mitchell. Professor Mitchell is a distinguished James McGill Professor in the Department of Integrated Studies with the Faculty of Education at McGill University. She is also an honorary professor in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, where she established the Center for Visual Methodologies for Social Change. Her research interests span work in schools with teachers and young people, particularly in the context of gender and HIV and AIDS, and studies in higher education of mainstreaming issues of gender, HIV and AIDS, and South Africa and Ethiopia. Her presentation title is Fire, Hope, and Social Change, Methodologies for Engaging with Young People. Over to you, Professor Mitchell.
Oh, thank you very much, Rebecca. And it's very, very lovely to be with you this afternoon or this morning, as it is in Montreal. I call my presentation Fire, Hope, and social change, as a nod to some of the earliest research that I was doing in South Africa 2 decades ago in Western Cape with young people in Atlantis and Khayelitsha. And our project ended up often being called Fire and Hope in the context of AIDS activism and addressing critical issues at the time. And I guess what as an emerging area is to think through fire, hope, and social change, and how we can think about both the personal and broader areas of change in in societies. And today, of course, I'll be focusing on methodologies. Next slide, please. So in my focus on methodologies, I draw on 3 broad questions. One that I think I have been citing for many years from Anne Oakley, the sociologist in the UK. What would it really mean to study the world of young people, both as knowers and as actors? To that question, I've been working on what methods and approaches are most effective in terms of supporting young people as co-producers of knowledge about health and social issues. And then thirdly, what are some ways that ensure that the views of young people are on the agenda for community and policy dialogue? So going beyond what we thought about in relation to fire and hope. And I have to start with a little quote from Matthew in Atlantis, who 2 decades ago said this about sexuality and change. So could we just hear Matthew?
One of the biggest challenges is this whole thing about your sexuality, who you are, when am I ready for sex, should I do it, shouldn't I? They thrown like the whole subject of sex like in our face and how we have to deal with it, and in between that we still have to find out who we are too, so it's like kind of complicated. It just complicates life.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Matthew was one of 14 young people who participated in the Fire and Hope or In My Life project starting in 2002. And just on to the next slide, Gabriella. Next slide.
What's the biggest challenge?
Oh, yeah, okay. So Matthew was one of 14 young people who Shannon Walsh, Mandla Oliphant, and I followed for almost 2 decades. We started working with them in 2002, and the kinds of complications that Matthew talked about were very, very, very critical. But we're really interested in how does activism in adolescence play out over time. I think when we first started, we thought it was a 2-year project. We never imagined it was a 20-year project. And we just recently published a book called In My Life, which chronicles the young people's perspectives into their 30s on what difference did the activism and the arts-based work that they engaged in Khayelitsha and Atlantis with our team in 2002, what difference has it made over time? And I think for me, it was like the beginning of really seeing that we need to understand personal change. And I loved it. We launched the book in Salt River, I think in December last year. So if you want to take a look at where did Matthew go from being 15, but certainly the idea of this is a true story and I am the narrator of that story is very, very critical. So over to the next slide is to really think about how do we get at those true stories and how do we get at that narration? And I know I'm in on a webinar where many people are interested in participatory work. My own work has been very much with the team at UKZN and at McGill on looking at the uses of photography and photo voice, digital storytelling, and most recently the whole area of cell filming and participatory video. And how can these particular methodologies be helpful for young people to express their concerns? Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on some of the work that we've been doing with cell filming, which didn't exist when we worked with Matthew in 2002, but does exist very much now in the context of very easy access to cell phones, but also iPads and other devices. And the term cell film was actually coined by Jonathan Dockney and Kayan Tomaselli from the University of KwaZulu-Natal to really refer to cell phone plus video. And or film. And for us, we've been working with this methodology for some time now. These are usually very short videos that deal with a social message and that most often are done in the context of participatory research. And we have worked out very detailed steps from brainstorming to storyboarding to visual ethics to the shooting of the films themselves, but highly importantly, the reflexive process and public screenings. So just to go to the next slide, next slide, please. We've been doing this work in many different countries, including Sierra Leone, Mali, South Africa, Ethiopia, and moving from the work on HIV, we have looked at many more related areas around early marriage, gender-based violence, FGM. And I'm going to show you right now a very short, a typical media message cell film that was produced in Sierra Leone a year ago. So let's take a look at it. It's on early marriage. Okay, let's sit back.
Greetings, Mama Haja.
Good morning.
I am here to be the bride of your daughter, to be my 5th wife.
No, she's too young.
But
yes, I'm too young.
She's too young.
She's too young. I am too young.
She's too young.
Yes, she's too young.
Say no to early marriage.
So just moving to the next slide. Oh, we've got lots of credits here as well. This is a typical cell film done in a very low-tech, no editing required approach. And I really want to highlight, you've seen, we have hundreds of these cell films that have been used in many, many different contexts, but they have a reflexive process. And I really want to highlight that. What did you like about your own cell film? What's the main message? What was your reaction to the other ideas and topics? Because typically there are many cell films produced in a particular group. If you were going to do it over again, what would you do differently? Could you even speak back and change the message? And most importantly, around social change, who should see these cell films? Is there someone who shouldn't see them? And that question will dominate the next two slides in terms of how do we get young people's voices, or how do we help young people to get their voices out there? So in the next slide, I'm just looking at this question: does anything change from getting the message out there, from the idea of showing these to other people? And I'm going to use two examples. Next slide, please. The first one is from Patterson in Eastern Cape. And this comes out of a project that I carried out with Lebo Moletsani, Nadine DeLonga, and Tosh Yamili, Lisa Vibasek, around gender-based violence. It was a 6-year study. And the girls there had done many, many different aspects of arts-based work, photography, cell filming. But what became really interesting to us is that the girls suddenly decided that they really needed to look at, how do you report rape? That is something that everyone kind of either takes for granted or it's not discussed. And so they set about making a film about how to report rape, and realized as they were doing it that they needed to talk to police officers, they needed to talk to medical people, and that actually nobody really agreed on how to report rape. But their videos, their cell films that came out of that really took this in a very, I think, a very local and very real way. And what they talked about was how they wanted to show it to many community members. This was, of course, a bit of a problem because when we had ethical approval, we did not necessarily have ethical approval to have all the videos shown publicly. So we had to go back and meet with parents, meet with caregivers who, once they saw what their daughters had made, agreed that these messages had to get out there. Just to look at the next slide, the notion of taking ownership as part of young people's engagement, I think, is really critical. So one of the pieces that they talked about was this question: who should see our cell films? And some people talked about police officers, how everybody in the community should, how neighbors should. They also talked about how maybe in their religious leaders, they should be concerned. They worried that perhaps that could be problematic, which is, again, this notion of having some say about how this work is used and having some say about where these ideas go as part of this notion of ownership. And of course, the cell films are just so accessible because they can be distributed or shared so many different ways. The second example, just going on to the next slide, next slide, please, comes out of LOSCOP in KwaZulu-Natal. Oops, just to go back one, just one back. Carol, oh yes. So this is also part of the same project it was called Networks for Change and Wellbeing, girl-led from the ground up policymaking to address gender-based violence. And this part of the project was led by Lebo and Lisa Libesek. And there, the girls did not identify rape as the critical issue. Although that was one key issue, they identified forced and early marriage as the issue that they were most dealing with when they did brainstorming, when they were going to make a film. And so they actually came up with this amazing narrative melodrama on forced and early marriage. And what was so interesting is that it was so powerful that the team realized that it really needed to be viewed by community members. And so you can see on the slide to the extreme right, a whole group of people in LOSCOP, family, parents, teachers, leaders, viewing that cell film about forced and early marriage. And I have to say that this is one of the most, I think, really amazing examples of the next steps, because people in the community started to say, oh, we've got to do something about this. And this actually led to the community leaders with the research team presenting this work in the legislature and coming up with what they call the LOSCOP Protocol on Forced and Early Marriage. If you want to read more about it, if you go to the IDRC website, there's quite a bit on it. But it was the notion that young people produced the video, the cell film, but it actually required adults to take some ownership of this as well. The young people did not appear in Pietermaritzburg in the legislature. The adults did, but it was their words and their ideas that took this forward. And I think that's the part that is so critical around this notion of fire, hope, and social change. A couple of years ago, Lebo and I guest edited a themed issue of Agenda called Girl-Led from the Ground Up Approaches to Policy Dialogue and Policy Change. And of course, some of these examples are in there, but we have written about many more since, and we've tried to document others since, to this idea of how can we take this work beyond the personal, but the personal being absolutely critical to this, into the social, and how do we have these broader discussions, and what are the challenges there. So I'm just going to end off on a slide about some of the future areas that I think are that we're thinking about, that we're working on. One of them in this whole area is around, what does time have to do with it? How is time, in a way, a methodological framework for thinking about young people and where they are? This, of course, was very important for the In My Life group, whom we followed over time for 2 decades, to think about the ups and downs and where are young people, where do we think something seems very successful and then suddenly someone plummets in their personal life, but then where do they go with this? And I think time is a huge piece of this. I've alluded to ethics. I believe that this is a huge area around young people and social change, and where are they positioned so that their vulnerabilities and their rights are acknowledged. And I think that this is a huge area that we can do more work on. Ensuring a focus on training researchers and professionals in these areas. People often say to me, well, how do you get policymakers to pay attention to young people's cell films, photo voice projects, or exhibitions, or other areas? And I am really interested in how we can study further the ways in which our professional training engages key leaders and early career researchers and new people, new researchers in the whole area of participatory research, and how can their participation become central to this. And then finally, the question of young people as policy advocates, both on the local and global stage, to me is really, really important. I think we are finally realizing that young people aren't the future, they are the now. And that the areas around HIV and AIDS right now, early marriage right now, rape right now, are the areas that we need to think about, and how to really bring further, I think, further analysis to both these local community, local and regional communities, but also the global stage. And some of the work that I'm working with Lebo and others right now is on that notion of gender transformation at a global stage, with young people at the center. So I will stop there right now. Thank you very much, Gabriella, for sharing my slides. And I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell. I just have two quick questions for you before we move to our artistic interlude. The first is, how does the metaphor of fire relate to your research? I think there was a little bit unclear what the role of fire is. And secondly, you raised this very briefly, but what kinds of ethical challenges arose in the research and how did you deal with them?
Okay, well, fire is really just getting excited. Fire and hope. So I feel like there's a passion to our work with young people, and young people bring kind of a passion. So the notion of fire was really about that. Although now I think of all the fires we have in the world, maybe we need a different metaphor. So I hope that's clear. The ethical issues are many. Everything from are the participants going to be identified? Are they going to, what kinds of ownership do they have? So the one in Patterson was really whether young people could show their videos to their cell films to others, when the ethical piece was originally to share them only in the research community, and to what extent is anonymity and confidentiality maybe broken wide open to think differently about that public space. That's only one example. The ownership one is another. I feel that so often young people produce things and then they're on our hard drives or in our external hard drives, but they don't have access to the material themselves. So that's just like a bigger aspect as well. Is that okay?
That's perfect. Thank you, Professor Mitchell. Thank you. We will now have an artistic performance led by Noluthando Buthelezi. Noluthando, over to you.
You never speak about the brutality of our silence. Though it cuts through the room and it is as loud as sirens, we pretend like it never happened. The day that HIV rang our doorbell and you never speak about the brutality of our silence. Though it cuts through the room and it is as loud as sirens, we pretend like it never happened. The day that HIV rang our doorbell and entered, we still have the blankness in our faces, holding you from a distance, living like we are sentenced, watching you battle with a chronic sickness. You water down the antiretroviral treatment, putting your hope in medicine and science like this is not a fight unto death, but one unto life. We look at you with wonder. How do you harness that power? On days when it gets harder, how do you separate yourself from the noise and the clutter? How do you remember to live, to take back your strength each time it attempts to leave? So you mumble these words under your bated breath. I am not a dying mother. You say that God will number your days and not a virus, that you will finish just as strong as you started and you will raise us like towers to stand tall in city centers, advocate for others, pour love like showers, because through you we know that there is life beyond a diagnosis. We know that the sickness can never deter you from purpose. You found your cure in faith and in love. Many people live with HIV. It marks not their end, but a new kind of beginning. They live to build wonderful families. They work, they contribute to large economies. They serve, they live, they love. They know their power because they know their status. Thank you.
Thank you, Noluthando, for that very thought-provoking and excellent performance. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Lynn Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks is a lecturer in the Division of Health Systems and Public Health in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University. She is a transdisciplinary researcher with a PhD in social science and public health. She has a keen interest in co-creative and co-productive research with communities and works with digital mediums as well as primary arts-based methods. The title of her talk is I Trust You, the Gift and Responsibility of Adolescent Health Research. Welcome, Dr. Hendricks.
Hi, good day. And thank you so much to Prof. Mitchell and Noluthando for that amazing piece. It really sets the scene very nicely for what I would like to share with you today. So I was involved in a research study with young women, most recently now the study, with young women with perinatal infections of HIV, and emanating from that study was this booklet called Doing Fieldwork in Challenging Circumstances and How We Summon Participatory Methods. It was co-edited by myself and two colleagues from KU Leuven, Prof. Karin Hannes and Ms. Chloe Diedrichs. And then we also have some chapters from local and also our international authors and researchers. But what I want to share with you today is a defining moment in my research work where somebody said, I trust you, and how that spurred me on to think around concepts of responsibility, but also how adolescent research is really a gift that we are given and an opportunity that should be considered as a gift for us as researchers. So I'm going to focus on three key things. When my study, which I call More Than a Pill, became I Trust You, I'm going to speak a little bit about responsibility and a little bit about the gift. So we focus specifically on adherence to antiretroviral treatment, and these were for young women born or having acquired HIV from their moms, either through pregnancy, through labor and delivery, or through breastfeeding. The overarching questions from that study was more around how does the environment, and how does the environment play a role in how young women negotiate their medication taking, and then how do we enable these environments to support young women. So I worked in Cape Town in a few communities here, Wallisdean, Bishop Lavis, Clark's Estate, Bonteville, very local communities, for us to look at the lived experience, both inside the community, inside their houses, inside the clinic, and in other spaces that they occupy. And by they, I mean young women. We used a participatory approach, so I am especially excited that I get to present with Prof. Mitchell today. I know when I was a young scholar, I chewed up any books or article that she wrote around participatory methods, so really one of my inspirations. I feel honored to speak with you today on this platform. And in this study, our main focus of the work was about how we engage the senses and experience the environment. So what do we see? What do we smell? What do we hear? What does it feel like? And you can see the camera traveled into their rooms in the clinic. It was a very participant-led process from how the objectives were written. So I didn't have any specific objectives besides the question, to how we report this information at the end. We produced a documentary which is on YouTube, and I'm happy to share the link with anyone in the chat. And from that documentary, we also had a screening where we had a community exhibition. And at this exhibition, we engaged with policymakers, young people, community members, clinic workers, researchers, academic students. It was huge. I think there was over 200 people there. And for the first time, I saw policymakers and young people, community members, and all kinds of stakeholders conversing on a really emotive level about a very important issue, about supporting young women. So when I originally designed the study, it was in the middle of COVID, and at the time, we couldn't go into the field to collect any data. So I was working on a theoretical level for the first 2 years, but one of the key issues for me in the conduct of participatory research is this issue of allyship. And I feel really disturbed when community-based research happens, but community members are accessed and then left, or people, especially students who are working on postgraduate studies, they go in, they collect the data, and then they leave. And with this particular group of young women who are already struggling with issues of loss, most of them are orphaned at a very young age. They don't have secure places of safety. They don't have friends. They hide a lot of themselves because of the secret and the shame that they carry, and a highly stigmatized disease. And I didn't want the research space to be a space where they would experience rejection, loss, loneliness, or a feeling of not having allies in this space. So we thought about these concepts of allyship, and we imagined an elastic band where if we unwound the band, we would all land up in the same space. But what did that space mean? What happens there? And we started thinking through concepts like transparency, being very open about what the purpose of the research was, respecting one another, being able to have many moments of reflection, thinking through issues like interaction, knowing that what you did affects me, what I do affects you, and a very strong reliance on equal intelligence. We are all experts when we are inside of the circle. And there's also freedom of movement, which was really great. But there was one moment in this research study that I will never forget. And I think I started the fieldwork part in January of last year. And 2 weeks later, this is a conversation I had with a participant. And I think it was called the Get to Know You interview. We were speaking about what makes her happy, and she was speaking about how she found out that, she had HIV. She was speaking about the loss of her father. And I asked her, are you okay with telling me all of this? And she looked at me, and she just had this depth in her eyes when she looked at me, and she said, yes, I trust you. And it's like the world just fell on my shoulders. At this point, I felt heavy with responsibility. So yes, I understood the ethics and I understood the responsibility. I have lots of experience in participatory work, but this moment was really a standout moment for me. And I realized that I am carrying a lot of responsibility in this process. And one of the key issues that I really had to think through for myself and negotiate along the way is this issue of power. And a lot of the time, people use power and agency interchangeably, but actually power is the capacity or the ability to direct or influence behavior. Agency is the ability to exert that power. We all technically have power. We all have the capacity to change and to influence things. And we all have agency, but in different amounts, depending on the situation or the time or the place that we are in. So theoretically, I was thinking through allyship in the third sphere, and we all have shared power, but I had to be really conscious about the moments that were created by all of us and who in those moments could exercise their power or felt comfortable enough to exercise their agency. And in participatory work, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about give me voice, give them voice, be their voice. Again, it sat uncomfortably for me because I already knew everyone has a voice. We can all talk, we can all speak, but we all don't feel safe or comfortable to do so. So there was nothing that I could give them they didn't already have. I couldn't give them a voice. I couldn't give them power. But what we could do is try to approach this work and say, look, let's find spaces to exercise our power together. So this is an extract of the book, which I really like, that researchers approach the task of PR with the belief that it is they who need to break the chains of their own power to a lesser degree when engaging with community members, approaching the work, the field, and others as perpetrators of research power crimes in waiting. It's as if we go in and say, oh, we have all the power, so I need to be aware of my power and my stance. No, everyone does. When you enter the research space, there's already existing power dynamics happening. And we need to be conscious of these risk profiles and power imbalances and how we negotiate this with stakeholders so that everyone is heard and valued in the research process. We actually have to rethink ourselves as researchers as powerful and participants as vulnerable, because participants actually hold a lot of power if you think about your research project. If everyone refuses to participate, your research is stagnant. If you collect all your data and everyone says, Lynn or researcher, we don't want our data in anymore, you've already spent all your resources, your project is dead.
Dr. Hendricks, are we correct that you don't have slides accompanying your presentation?
Oh my goodness, I forgot to share. I've been sharing my slides this whole time with myself.
Let's backtrack a little bit and look
Let
at this.
me
Please share the rest of the
my
group.
apologies.
Don't worry, Dr. Hendricks, there's time, so you can take us through from the briefly if you'd like, not to worry.
So I will just briefly just pause and go back to the key slides. So this is the slide around adherence to medication. I do apologize for this.
No
the
problem.
Main research questions around the environment and how we enable it. The communities that we worked in of Wallisden, Clark's Estate, Bishop Lavis, Alces River, and Bonteville. Here are some of our photographs from our participatory experience. This is the one with the camera in the room. And in here, the participants laying with their eyes closed, thinking through, what do you smell? What do you hear? What can you feel? How does the room feel that you're in? This is the movie that is loaded on YouTube, which I will share the link. Here are some pictures of the exhibition. So these are large A0 posters, life-size boxes with all their photo voice pictures on them. This body maps, I think, is 4 meters big. There's a story where people could engage and write notes to the participants. Here's objects we collected along the way on top of our storyboard. And here's a map of all the actors that are in the story of adherence to art. So here is the slide which I alluded to around the third sphere and the actors unwinding the rubber band and moving into the same space and what happens in the space. And this is the moment, the defining moment. We were having tea and eating something and she said, yes, I trust you. And this is a very special moment for me. I spoke about power and agency, how we all have power, but we often don't have spaces to exert that power, which is agency. And then we spoke a little bit about voice and how we say, you know, be their voice, give them voice, but we all actually have voices that we can share. So I think we are here now where we're speaking about existing power, that when we go into a space, participants already have power that they hold, and we aren't always the ones that are most powerful. The participants actually hold a lot of power with them, that they can make or break your project. They are powerful people. They are human beings. And we need to prepare ourselves to not think that way, that I am the one that needs to break these power chains. Rather, it's about, I need to think about where the imbalances are and what the risk profiles are. Something else that you need to keep in mind is that power dynamics often shift from one aspect to another. So I might be powerful in a church space, for example, but when I go home, I'm not as powerful in what I can do or the agency I have. Or when I go to work, I'm perhaps in a lower rank position. So where I find myself in time and space makes a difference to the power dynamics where we are. Again, something you have to keep in mind. It's your responsibility as the researcher. So in working with these different role players in the project, we found that there was a shift when we gathered around the table with one another and we had one agenda. That all of a sudden, when we walked into the room, didn't matter who you were, your voice counted. And this didn't happen at the beginning. It happened and evolved throughout the project. So just to check, Rebecca, you can see the slides now on entangled power, right? Okay. Okay. The second type of power is the power inside of things. So really working on power as an asset, so that one change in power would change the course of events for others. So we had a young girl who wasn't very confident. She didn't feel that she could talk in front of others. She wanted to be in our space. She wouldn't say anything. And after the group meeting, we would sit alone and she would just, it's like verbal diarrhea, all the thoughts that she was holding. And we never forced her, but another participant noticed. And in our next meeting, the other participant said, I would like to hear from you what you think. But it wasn't me saying that. It was another participant. And all of a sudden, she started talking. But that participant decided to give some space to the other. And it doesn't always have to be me. And then lastly, exiting power. No one leaves the space unchanged. So even now, after the fact, we are still connected with one another. There are still changes that happen for me and for them. And it's my responsibility as a researcher to be aware of all of this. So these are our participants. As you can see, the identities are hidden. These are the portraits that we took. But there are other responsibilities that I adopt as a researcher based on this experience, is that I've got an ethic and moral responsibility. So to do that, I adopt a values-based approach when I approach my work now. So even in the protocols, I write the values are going to be respect, transparency, equity, reflexivity. I also am responsible for being aware about my own and their emotional safety and vulnerability. So I'm still busy with my reflections of this process, because on an emotional level, it really affected myself and my family too. It was about going into dangerous spaces. It was about seeing dead bodies. It was about being at the forefront of violence and living the experience with them. It was about hearing their stories. And I'm a trained psychologist. So I think other researchers who perhaps don't have experience in working with mental health, this could be a very difficult process. So when we work with adolescents, we have to be aware about this. And then constantly being aware of and mindful of negotiating power and agency. But most importantly, I have a responsibility to tell the story in the way that they would like it. So I'd like to end with the gift of adolescent health research. I mean, young people are so amazing. They give the freshest perspectives and unique ideas about research topics. They're in a stage of life where they're forming their own opinions, their own identities, and it can really bring a lot of innovation to research. If we think about the future impact we are making, we are working with the future generation who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. Their ideas are going to inform policies and interventions that will impact society. There's potential for long-term studies when you start in adolescence or younger. We have an opportunity to create interventions at very early stages. There is enhanced collaboration. If I think about this project and how it grew, if you think about the network map, there were their parents, their peers, their cousins, their schools, their communities, their youth groups, their churches. They are so connected at that point. It also really helps with public engagement because of the types of methodologies we use. And then also the personal fulfillment of working with young people. I mean, they are so creative. I don't think I've worked with a group of people in research who inspired me as much in the methods and the way I was challenged to innovate research methods to make the study work for them and with them. And they also had the best ideas. Generally, it was just fun. I don't think there's a better word in terms of the gift for working with young people. So my message, and I always end my presentations with this, is from our young people. These are their postcards that they made with the one word that they learned from the study, was to listen, to understand, to be brave, stand against violence and stigma, to focus on the things that really matter, hope and have faith in a better tomorrow, and believe that you can live. Your medication will give you life. Most importantly, remember to connect with yourself, with others, and with your culture. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for that excellent presentation, as well as Professor Mitchell. Dr. Hendricks, a question on sampling. How did you generate your sample, and how did you enroll people in the research study? And then secondly, at the end of the study, how did you disconnect? You've clearly built amazing relationships with people. They're comfortable with you. They trust you. How do you disengage from your research participants when the project has come to an end?
Thank you. So in terms of enrollment, it was a very set inclusion criteria. They had to be between the ages of 17 and 23. And they had to be perinatally infected with HIV. So I worked through the clinics. I sent my inclusion criteria. I worked with the nursing staff. They gave me a list of people. And they contacted those young women because of the POPI Act and said, you know, this study, you can come in and meet the researcher if you want to participate. And whoever, you know, came up, I then enrolled them into the study, if this is what they wanted to do. In terms of disconnection, that hasn't happened. So I don't think it's possible if you go to this deep layer of allyship with participants, you can't disconnect. I mean, I've been at births now. I've been there when there's breakups. I've been there when there's family problems. We still chat on WhatsApp. There's still a WhatsApp group. We still go out to eat. We still connect with one another. So the research is over, but the connections are still there, which I'm not complaining about. It's great.
There's longevity in that. Thank you for those comprehensive answers, Dr. Hendricks. We will move straight from here to our panel discussion. Allow me to introduce our three panelists. Dr. Neziswa Titi is a lecturer in the African Feminist Studies Department and an academic psychologist at the University of Cape Town. She is a transdisciplinary scholar and academic activist with governmental and civil society organizational leadership affiliations. Her scholarship focuses on decolonial thought, African psychology, child sexual violence and trauma, and child-centric methodologies. Welcome, Dr. Titi. Our second discussant is Lebo Seutlwadi, who holds a master's degree in psychology. Her area of interest is sexual reproductive health and rights and adolescents and young people. She has over 10 years of experience in research, monitoring and evaluation in the fields of sexual and reproductive health, HIV/AIDS, and gender studies. She has worked at the Health Systems Trust and at the Human Sciences Research Council in the HIV/AIDS, STIs, and TB Research Unit as a chief researcher. And our third panelist is Alice Clarfelt, who is a participatory action research specialist, adult educator, and coach. She has worked for 17 years in the fields of sexual and gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and youth empowerment. Alice's PhD, still under examination, used Augusta Boyle's Theatre of the Oppressed to explore critical understandings of gender oppression with South African youth. Welcome, panelists. I'd like to invite you to please enable your cameras and to pose your questions to the presenters. Let's follow the order used in the introductions, beginning with you, Dr. Titi.
Hello, everybody. And thank you so much for the wonderful thought pieces. As you were speaking, I was just asking myself around, I had two little questions. And the first question I have is to Claudia. The question I have is around ethics. What are the ethics with regards to studying a person for such a long time, from the time that they were a child up older. And the reason I'm asking this question is to try and understand what you what you were thinking about in terms of are they still ready for this? Are they still understanding what is expected of them? So because it is such a long time that they are part of your work. The question to both Claudia and Lynn is that is around a single story with regards to a particular type of people, African people, right? You are the work we do is with the communities of a particular class, a particular race, if you may. What are the single stories that we are arriving with that? And would you say that the findings we may have are reachable to other people as well? The question I'm asking is around a single story when we are choosing our samples. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Okay. Should I just jump in, Rebecca?
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, thank you so much for those. That's a great question, and also just Lynn, I just want to thank you for your amazing presentation. It's beautiful. So the ethics in longitudinal research or over time, I think is a really tricky one. And I'm going to start by saying that Bryn Neal, who is a sociologist from the UK, has done a lot of work in this area as well to kind of think through what does it mean to have negotiated consent over time, and how do we keep going back to consent, because I think that's also part of it. We often think, oh well, people consented at the beginning, but what they consented to at the beginning of research, even to say that I can show somebody's video or their cell film over time, do I need to go back to them, and so on, I think is really, really important. In the case of the project in the In My Life Fire and Hope 20-year project, we actually did a lot of negotiations because we had different research funding over time. So our original project was a 2-year project funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. So our ethical piece was really just to work with 15, 16, 17-year-olds for those 2 years. Then Shannon Walsh, who was my co-researcher, did her master's degree with this group. So she had ethical consent. Then she went on to do her PhD and also ran several projects with AWID. So each one of these projects had a new ethical piece. Eventually, in the last parts of the project, I would say it was no longer a research project, but a co-led project. And the book that we wrote in my life, although Shannon and Mandla and I edited it, each participant has their own chapter. And we actually went back to the transcripts that we had kept over time. And we had a whole event in Simonstown in 2020, where participants came together and they read their own transcripts and decided we actually developed something called memory books, where people could kind of choose which parts of the transcripts they wanted to talk about. But at that point, they were really, I would say, co-researchers. And we did have ethical clearance to do this work, but I think we were long past the research process. We were well into this notion of working together as adults. So I think that there's, for me, this is like, I feel like the area of longitudinality is really, really critical. And I'm interested in talking to other people about how they're doing this. But I think it definitely changes over time, and that it's very hard. I can't imagine getting permission to do a 20-year project in the first place, but I can imagine thinking this in a negotiated way. And not all of the 14 participants participated at the very end, and indeed one person died. So we did not have everybody, but all the people who were there at the end were still consenting, and they all consented to their transcripts and they worked on them. So I think it's really documenting that part of the consent process as people go into adulthood. I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you for the great question.
Professor Mitchell, thank you. Can I invite Dr. Hendricks to maybe respond?
Absolutely. I think one of the key risks of doing this kind of work, because media stays forever, right? Once you post it on YouTube, it's there to stay. And you can be 40 years old and now you're on YouTube and you see this documentary where you featured when you were a teenager, 17, 18 years old, and you listen to yourself and it's still there. And that's something that, as you grow in this area of digital arts-based research, it's key issues that you must reflect on. So thank you for the question. One of the ways that I think we spoke about it is that we purposefully avoided stereotypes. So you will see a lot when they speak about colored women or, brown-skinned women in South Africa, it's about drinking and drugs, being very sexualized. Then if you watch the documentary, we don't mention that at all, because we're not trying to attach stereotypes to the women in the film. What you see are the stories that are authentic about them, about their experiences, and it's not the whole story. So they told us the whole story, but we spent months curating the story to the one they wanted it to be, cutting and pasting and moving things around. The other thing is about showing their whole lives, not just the bad, the good and the bad. What makes them happy? What are their aspirations? What do they want to do? What do they see for the future? What advice do they have for others? So it's not just a sad story. And that's a lot why we broke this movie up into two parts. So the first one is called More Than a Pill, which focuses on the story of adherence. The second movie is called Born to Thrive, which is about what they are living for, what they want to be, where they want to go. And then I think also the biggest issue is to really interrogate the complexity of lived experience. So it's not just to focus on the one phenomena, but focus on the intersectionality. And that's where the other stakeholders come in. That's where showing B-roll or footage of the communities they live in, of the spaces they occupy, but not just their communities, the pretty places we went to go do the interviews, the creative works that they made, the visually pleasing and aesthetic things, so when people see the movie, it's not just, oh, this is a sad story. It's about, wow, this art is amazing. These photos are great. These women did something wonderful. So I think keeping your finger on the pulse around intersectionality, complexity, sensitivity, stereotyping. I think those are key issues to think about when you are working with digital mediums. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now over to Lebo Seutlwadi to pose her questions.
Thank you so much both for the presentation. It was really thought-provoking. I think what we often take for granted, or the traditional route rather, is that as researchers, we come into a space, we've already identified the problem, we've already identified what the solution is, and we just impose it. And after that, we pack our things and we go. So it's very much refreshing to see that in this stage where we are right now, we are moving more towards actually involving the people that are supposed to be beneficiaries of these researches that we do, from inception to them identifying what the problem is, and also them also coming up with a solution that is sustainable beyond our presence in the space. Maybe my question is more around what do you think is needed to actually encourage more of this approach rather than the traditional approach where we place blame on either lack of knowledge or place blame on things that we actually have no idea about? Is there more that we can do to be more aware of the power and the fact that agency is actually context specific? You know, we all have a sense of agency, but to what extent that can be exercised, it's actually context specific. Is there more that you've learned from the research that you've done that you can pass it on to upcoming researchers and certainly to ourselves who are listening in? Thank you.
You can invite Professor Mitchell and then Dr. Hendricks to respond.
Okay. Thank you. That's a great question, Lebo, because that is, I mean, I think you grasp the passion, and you grasp, I think, the beauty of this, and seeing Lynn's slides as well in terms of why this is so important. I'll go back to a point that I mentioned at the end of my presentation, where I think that our training process for new researchers in healthcare, I work in education. I also do a lot of work in social work as well, that it's absolutely critical that the kind of training that we do at this point is really, really key. And I've worked with Lebo Moletsani on, we've looked at training modules, how, they could be online training modules, many, many different areas where people are absolutely not only exposed to the areas, but as much as possible, deeply immersed in the work themselves. I'm convinced that anyone who has ever done photo voice or made a cell film or created a collage will never be the same again, regardless of whether they're 15 or 80. Or 25, that if you are involved in the process yourself, you can see this. And my dream is kind of like, oh, I would like to have every single policymaker in the world be part of producing a documentary themselves, or producing photos of where they feel safe and not so safe, or where they feel that they have agency or don't have agency. And the kinds of protocols and prompts that we use with young people are really kind of universal. I think the notion, when Lynn talked about the different forms of power, we're all engaged in different forms of power. So I really think that is one key area that all of us who work in higher education and professional development need to really think about. It's lovely to see how somebody else did it, but it is absolutely crucial to start with oneself. And I think the reflexivity and positionality that is required to do this kind of work has to start, or has to come somewhere in people's actual professional development. So I have many other thoughts about this, but this is an area of, and also, of course, in encouraging funders to see the value of this. So again, this work happens because we have funds to do this. So it's actually, reaching the IDRCs or the Human Sciences Research Council of various groups who are already inclined to or could do this kind of, or could support this kind of work. So I'll come back maybe to other points, but I really take that as being a really key feature of the future of professional training, is to see that people are really steeped in this work themselves.
Professor Mitchell, please do come back to those points. We've got time. Please air your thoughts. Go ahead.
I think Prof. Mitchell answered that very well, and I 100% agree with her. It's how we report what we do, I think, is also another key thing, because sometimes when we write up these studies, we don't really engage in these nuances or the experiences of the researcher. So even for my own study, I mean, I did this PhD by publication, I was submitting publications, and only now, 2 years after the fact, I'm starting to reflect on my own experiences, to think through these issues, to document what happened. So I think that's something, you know, we can also encourage researchers to do, is to mention this in your journal articles. You know, add a little paragraph about power negotiations, the same way you talk about sampling, the same way you talk about trustworthiness, credibility, reflexivity. Speak about power and agency. Nobody's going to shoot you in the foot for mentioning those things, but the more they become normalized in publications, the more people start using them, talking about them, and thinking about them.
Absolutely spot on. I'd like now to invite Alice Clarfelt to provide her questions and comments.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. And again, thanks so much for the wonderful presentations. As someone who believes very strongly in participatory methods and participatory action research, it's wonderful to see how the methods are being used, and the way that young people use these very vibrant, experiential, innovative methods, which I could see in the comments as well. People were saying, like, these are good methods, people like them. So, you know, one of the things I was thinking about is kind of the diversity of participatory methods that we can use with people, how they access them, how they utilize them. The way you were talking about kind of raising questions around co-production of knowledge, how we really understand young people and marginalized young people from backgrounds of historical oppression as knowledge producers, as experts. The nature of personal change through research. And I think you're talking about personal change with the people you're doing research with, but also personal change of the researcher. And Lynn, I was really, I could really relate to what you were saying about the sort of transformation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but, you know, your own kind of personal change and connection with participants, and actually really good participatory action research should transform the researcher. Because if we're really thinking about us as being co-producers of knowledge, we should be changed through the research. It shouldn't just lead to a change in participants. The questions you're raising now around positionality, I think, is just so key, and the nature of power within the space, who has power, and I think, you know, what do we want to do with the kind of power that exists within the research space? So yeah, I just raised lots of really important questions for me again. I guess I don't want to talk too much, but I mean, I was returning to the philosophy of Paulo Freire. I mean, my participatory approach is really kind of comes from the Freirean background and theatre of the oppressed, especially when we're working in a context like South Africa, and we are wanting to recognize that people have been historically oppressed and voices have been marginalized. So what does it mean to amplify voice, not just of young people, but of young people from these particular backgrounds? And I think one of the questions that really came up for me is, what's the relationship between personal and social change? And what do we understand? What do we want for the kind of social change that comes out of the research project? And how is that connected to how the research methods are amplifying voice? And because I think that's one thing that I really stood out. It's like these methods are amplifying voice. What kind of personal change is that leading to, and what's the relationship between that and social change? Yeah. I guess that's a question that I'm posing to both of you.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll start with Professor Mitchell and then move on to Dr. Hendricks.
Wow. You pack a lot of questions in there, Alice. That's great. And I think a very important, you're leading to your question around the links between personal change and social change and the transformation of researchers. Maybe I'll start with that and then work back, because something I've been working on right now is kind of looking at the notion of gender transformation. And, you know, a lot of the work that I do is around gender-based violence and many aspects of forced and early marriage and so on. But some of the notions in gender transformation are, you know, how do we think about the voices of girls and women? How do we see boys and men as allies? How do we think about reflexivity? But I think that question of where are we in the picture? How are researchers part of that transformative process? Not only in how we do research, but also in our everyday lives. I think that's a piece that, I'm not I think it works back to this notion of from social change to personal change. How can you be involved in a project where you're thinking about power or thinking about the relationships between, you know, intergenerational relationships or intersectionality in relationships, and not have that go back into your own life as a researcher and as a research team. So I think a lot of the work that many of us do is also ties into working in collective spaces of how do we understand power in the work that we do with the research teams. As a seasoned researcher, how do you work with early career researchers? As an early career researcher, how do you think through where are you in the team process and so on? So I think that question of social and personal actually is well situated within our work as researchers. And again, back to the question of where do we actually get to explore this work? How do we deal with positionality? How do we actually explain the transformative process? When Shannon Walsh and Mandla Oliphant and I worked on the book In My Life, our first couple of chapters were really, I mean, the participants we worked with got 20 years older. But so did we. It was like really interesting. Where was I when I was doing this work in 2000 and 2001 and 2002? And where was I 20 years later? And what kinds of process did I have? Shannon was the very same age as one of the one of the youth leaders. And so Mandla, so in a sense, they kind of grew together. So those kinds of pieces I think are really critical to try to reflect on. And in the book, In My Life, we actually feel like we should write another book about more of this, because we didn't want the book to be about us. We wanted the book to be about the participants. But there were so many stories that we would like to tell further that we think are valuable. Or that are valuable to us and that we think are part of the process. So that social and personal, social working back to the personal working to the social is really critical. For the participants themselves, I think that goes back to really maybe how people, this notion of what does it actually mean to speak up or to speak out? And this may be a very personal moment for a participant. And I think some of the young people that Lynn talked about, they're also critical. So there's this moment of the personal, but actually being able to do that in a social milieu or a community milieu is really, really important in this. So I think that it's personal for the person to speak out. And maybe that is part of agency, part of their own positionality, but being able to see themselves as an actor in the social realm is part of it. And I guess I would go back to Anne Oakley's work on this, knowers and actors. Knower, I'm speaking up. actor, I'm speaking out or I'm speaking back. And so I think the language of speaking out, speaking back, speaking, those kinds, that framework, I think is really helpful for thinking about the personal and the social. I think I will just babble on forever now, so you should just stop me. And let's go over to Lynn. I'd love to hear what she has to say.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell, especially for your comments on voice and engagement. Thank you. Lynn, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Alice, that is a power punch. It really is a power punch. And for me, one of the, going into this project, I think in 2017, I had big dreams that I was going to change the world in terms of sharing stories. At the time, I was working in systematic reviews. There was very little evidence for young women with perinatal infections. So we were plugging gaps, and I wanted to make a difference. At the end of this process now, 6 years later, the fact that I have a mom that tells me her daughter is more confident, she can assert herself, she can tell me how she feels. I have a brother who says, I didn't know my sister felt this way about things. That is enough of an impact. And so it doesn't always have to be on a grand scale. Using participatory methods is really powerful because it allows people to go into spaces in themselves that they might not have ventured in very comfortable ways. But it allows them to see things, speak about things they haven't done before. We had a participant who never could say that she had HIV. She always said, I have TB. Every single interview, every single time, she said, I have TB. Even when she went to the clinic, she said, I'm going for my TB medication. She just had a block and she couldn't say it because her father died of HIV. We had another one who couldn't speak about her medication without crying because it was so traumatic for her. And at the end, she was the one that did the poetry, that spoke about the stories, that shared it in public. So examples like that tell me that impact is really something you need to think of from the individual level to the societal level. And because the impact on the individual level has been so much, it really sits with people when they see the stories evolving. And so it makes further impact for other people who witness the stories or witness the moments where participants find themselves. In terms of the impact of the research on the researchers, I wrote a whole chapter in my PhD about how the study affected me. And it was not my intention to do so, but after I wrote it down, I realized how much had changed in my life over the period, but also how much of these lessons have changed how I see and do research. It also brought to my awareness how much lip service I paid as a participatory researcher before. And it brings me back to the point we spoke about before, which was about longitudinal studies and issues around time. Usually in participatory research, they are very short-lived projects, workshops that happen once off short. But because this was so long and I could engage with participants and I got to know them on a relational level, and I had the space to grow and evolve in the same project, I could see where my own gaps, points of growth, things I needed to work on in myself as a researcher to make myself a better researcher for the future. So I don't think that we pay enough attention to that. And one of the key things I wrote about is about social change. I mean, if I take my participants, myself, and a handful of other people, that's 12 people that have been transformed in the process. Is that enough of social change? Yes, it is, absolutely. Even one person is. And that's just how I see it from now. You spoke about, who has the power? What do we want to do with the power in the spaces? And it goes back to what the purpose of your research is. So if you are doing a PAR project or an action research project where you are hoping to make a change or you're working towards something, then your considerations for power and what you do with it are different to if you are exploring a concept, if you are trying to understand something or you're trying to describe something, right? Because now we're just trying to get to the bottom of people's stories. But when I go into a space with policymakers, how I negotiate my power is very different to how I negotiate it with a group of young people, because I'm so scared of them. They're so intimidating. Primary school kids scare me. I struggle to talk to them. You know, it's just, I think that these issues of power is something that is so complex. And then lastly, I just want to reflect, if it's okay, Rebecca, there's a comment in the chat around the impact of the study. And it is more emphasis should be placed on reflexivity, how we are aware of our presence, how we are perceived by participants, and how it affects the way the participants respond. And that is absolutely true. So even when we went for lunch, I never paid for lunch in front of the participants. I would either prepay at the front, or I would wait till we left, and then I would come back and then I would pay. Because the simple act of taking out my wallet introduces more power, right? It says, I have money to pay and I'm giving you food. But if we just go in, we sit down, we chat, we eat, and we leave, it's a very different experience. So I think when you speak about these things in your reflexivity, it's about drawing in the real examples so that other people can learn, and also bring up these examples of how to avoid these complexities around power, or how to negotiate them better. So I'll stop there. So that we can field some more questions.
Thank you. It's a real challenge for participatory action research to carve out a niche, because, you know, from a kind of empirical, more quantitative background, we're really dealing with expert anecdote rather than proper research findings. So there's an element in which we really have to assert the validity of the method and make sure that our findings are regarded as valid. So there's been lots of action in the chat. I'd like to pose a question from Fatima Peters, who says, in the academic discourse, do we have the space and are we allowed to say what happened, or do we sanitize our work for publication? Then you've got the floor, so let's start with you.
You know, yes. As a systematic reviewer, it's easy for me to speak to this because I see how people report their qualitative research. Especially when we look at the qualitative research, and in terms of what people say about the methods, they're also always really so sparse, and they don't give enough depth. I think the tides are changing, and I think how people are reporting are changing. I think you get to a point where you can tell an editor, this is important for my paper, it needs to stay in here, and I don't want to negotiate about that. And if they don't want your paper, sometimes, you know, students, and I understand researchers, can't afford highly paid journals, and they have to kind of make do with journals that will take their paper and they concede and say, okay, because you're going to publish my paper, I'll take this out. Be smart about it then. Add it as an appendix, an additional file, and say, please see my reflexivity in the additional file. Okay, you don't have to remove it. You can find ways to leave it in. But I think you don't have to sanitize your work for anybody. There are places that will publish your work as is. And if you don't find it in the journal article, write for the newspaper, write a blog, post it online, write a brief, send it around, go on the radio. I mean, from what they've been exposed to working in knowledge translation, there are always opportunities to share work, especially if you are working in participatory research methods in the media. Journal articles are not the only place where you can share your academic research. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn, for that comprehensive response. Let me come to Professor Mitchell and ask her about the challenges of sanitizing one's work for publication.
Oh, well, I totally agree with everything Lynn just said in terms of the breadth and range of ways of publishing. I also, as an editor of a journal myself, I'm the editor-in-chief of Girlhood Studies. I think we really invite this kind of dialogue. So I suggest that you really think through the journals that you choose. And I realize in the that there, you know, there are many challenges there, and finance is one of them. So thinking through what journal is really going to be interested in this, and like choosing the journal before you write the article, so that you know that they're going to be interested in the problematics, the positionalities, the things that you don't want to leave out. I guess I would also really encourage people, as you're moving along, and if in your own research, if you're someone who is in a position where you can say, I would really like to guest edit a themed issue of a journal, that you start thinking through what are some ways that you could actually frame the problematics of reflexivity, positionalities, and so on for a journal. I know Agenda is an example of a journal that would be very open to this. Other feminist journals, South African journals, as well as, you know, in the region and internationally. So don't be afraid to team up with someone else, especially if you can work in a research team, to actually propose themed issues around these areas, because these are the things that we've talked about this morning, and the issues that, or this afternoon, pardon me, still morning for me, the issues that people are bringing up are not unique to what Lynn and I are talking about. Every single researcher who is attempting to do this work is coming up with, this is part of the project of participatory work. It is around power, it is around change, it is around these pieces. So I really encourage people to think through, okay, where is there a journal that I'm interested in already? And might you suggest a theme where we are actually building the kind of knowledge that we think is so critical in participatory research. So I think it's like, and there's, you know, like the journal Young, there are youth studies, there are many different outlets. And I think many editors would be open to the suggestion of doing themed issues. And of course, the other thing is to have more webinars and events like this too, where the problematics become the central knowledge generation of the work. So again, many different outlets. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can just push you, because we obviously have an audience which wishes to publish our academic work on participatory action research. If I can just push you, you mentioned Agenda, you mentioned Young. Can you give us other examples of journals which might be interested in participatory action research?
Oh, well, I think just in the South African context, Educational Research for Social Change, ERSA, comes out of Nelson Mandela University. It has a strong, obviously, education focus, but I think they define education in pretty broad ways. So they also would be very interested in this. I'm thinking of, there is a journal called Participation. There's also the Journal of Visual Studies, which takes a lot of participatory research. It's international in scope. So of course there would be take on some sort of an international piece. I'd be very happy to put together a little listing after, you know, in the next day or two to share. If we have a mailing list to send out, I'd be very happy to do that. But really, those are qualitative inquiry, the International Journal of Qualitative Methodologies, which is actually edited by Linda Liebenberg, who's a South African who lives in Canada. But that really puts methodology at the center. You can't publish in that journal unless it is about methodology, and problematics are not just the problematics, but the generative aspects of reflexivity and positionality and participation would be really critical.
Thank you. We're running out of time. I see that Angelina Goy has raised her hand. Can I please ask her to unmute and make herself available for video to ask her question? Angelina Goy.
Thank you.
Angelina, we can't hear you. I think your line is a bit ropey. Can you hear us?
Yes, hi everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for giving me this chance of asking a question to you. But actually, it was not a question, but I was trying to share and motivating what Miss Hendricks was trying to say. So as last time, then we had Susan, and we also I tried to speak about the youth club on how are we going to involve those adolescents before going to start the research. That we are going to speak to those people who knows more about what we are going to do than just start to apply our own ethics. So and as I gave an example that we have those youth clubs where for example here in Tanzania we have those youth clubs whereby those youth clubs have got adolescents who are both HIV positive and some are HIV negative, and they meet together, and researchers, they come to ask for advice. So they use the youth club as a link before going to the society, before applying their methodology in finding out what they want. So I think also in other country, before starting our research, we can try to find out if there are these clubs, because these clubs are going to help us find out about what we are going to apply, if is acceptable, if what are these people going to feel about what we are going to do, especially for adolescents, because most of the program for adolescents are being implemented by people who are aged, so they only apply what they think is right, but they don't see what we need. So adolescents, we have our own needs, we have our own ways to be approached. So for these different programs for adolescents, I think the best way approaching them and finding out if they are comfortable and they're going to really give us accurate results. It's important because adolescents, we have a behavior to tend to hide. If we are not comfortable, we hide. But if we are comfortable, we open up. And when we open up, we help the researcher to know the whys and help us in our problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're almost at time. In fact, we're at time. So I've got one last question to pose to the speakers. The question is, you've both spoken about photos and videos as experiential methods. What about journaling as a means of participatory method with young people? Angelica, you can turn your camera off. Thank you. The issue of journaling or the prospect of journaling as a means of data collection. Ariana Fada, I see that you've raised your hand, but we're actually out of time. So if I can just ask the last question about the role of journaling from our two speakers.
Oh, I'll jump in. Yes, absolutely. Especially we've used kind of like reflexive process with beginning teachers as a data collection technique. But I think young people have also, I think in community-based research have put together journals or other forms of writing. We put together a little book called In My Life, which is also the same title as the book we had, where young people went through a writing process, and they created sort of poetry, but with prompts like in my street, whatever, or something that worries me. And we used, it was a type of journaling, I would say, to actually come up with poetic pieces. But I've certainly have known other people who have used journals in maybe a more maybe a more not necessarily in a poetic piece, but in I guess a more straightforward writing every day, or collect those kinds of reflections. Different forms of writing. We worked with an Indigenous group in Canada where, again, they were writing more according to particular prompts that were perhaps came from the research team and the group, as opposed to maybe free writing. So I'm not sure if the person who asked this was also thinking about free writing. So, but could be very powerful.
Dr. Hendricks.
Yes, I have responded in the chat. Very similar. You can use it either as a reflective process where it's for them and they keep it to organize their thoughts, or you can have a structured journaling approach where they bring it with them to different sessions or they hand it in. It really depends on how you want to engage with that journal.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to wrap up the conversation now. Thank you all for attending today, for your interest and your questions. Thank you to our speakers, artists, and panelists. Thank you to the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and to IAVI for sponsoring this event. Please note that as you exit the Zoom platform at the end of the webinar, a very brief evaluation will pop up. Thank you for taking a moment to complete it. Your feedback will help us improve the webinar series going forward. The session has been recorded and will soon be available to view on the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation's YouTube channel. So once again, everyone, a big thank you to our speakers, to everyone who's asked questions and posed questions and engaged in the conversation. It's been a very rich one. I feel very edified, and I also feel more confident about being able to use participatory action research in my own work. So thank you very much, and take care, everyone. Goodbye.